Care Centers. Your path to recovery starts here. Now here's your host, Gus Logue.
Good morning and welcome to episode 32 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined, as I am every Thursday, by Mia O'Brien of Helmets and Heels. Today we're going to be talking about Detroit Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson and why he is such a hot head coach candidate, both this upcoming head coach cycle and in previous cycles. But before we get to that, we're going to start the show like we do every show with some Jaguars trivia. Andre Cisco is one interception away from placing second among safeties in team history. Which safety ranks first in Jaguars history for career interceptions? Is it A, Reggie Nelson, B, Deshaun Gibson, C, Chris Hudson, or D, Donovan Darius? I think this one should be pretty easy for fans who at least have been following the team for a long time. But Mia, what do you think? You got a guess for that one?
I'm wondering, is it retroactive? I mean, Deshaun Gibson's played for a lot of teams here, but I'm going to guess Donovan Darius. But at the same time, maybe Gip across his career maybe comes a little close.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair point. I just threw Gip in there because he was a recent guy to add in. But yeah, you're right. It is Donovan Darius. But Andre Cisco is currently tied with Chris Hudson for interceptions with, I believe, 7. So if he gets one more, potentially this week against Jared Goff, who just threw 5 interceptions last week, then he would rank second behind only Jaguars legend Donovan Darius. So, yeah, we're not here to talk too much about the Jaguars, though, Mia, especially since they are 2-8 heading into a brutal Week 11 matchup in Detroit against arguably the best team in the NFL in the 8-1 Lions. But, again, we wanted to talk today about Ben Johnson, who's been the offense coordinator for the Lions for a few years now. He originally was a grad assistant at Boston College and then spent a lot of time with the Miami Dolphins under a lot of just bad offenses, but it was a lot of different offenses. And then he went to Detroit under Matt Patricia, actually, and just got retained by Dan Campbell. And so he's been a very kind of like under the radar candidate since he's really just got a lot of experience from bad Miami teams. And that's what makes him partly so interesting as a candidate is that it's like, oh, he's not just Sean McVay's barista or like someone who's clearly from one type of scheme, basically.
Is that a shot at LA baristas? Come on now, Gus Logue.
No, but
I know like they love coffee out there, but come on, son.
Honestly, Ben Johnson's scheme is probably, if you had to compare it to one, it's probably closest to McVay or probably Shanahan more than McVay. But the point is that his scheme is like from a bunch of different ideas, and it's not just one thing. And so, yeah, what do you think makes Ben Johnson such an interesting candidate, or especially since he's kind of an under the radar name? Not really anymore, since he has been candidate in the coaching cycle for a little bit now. But generally speaking, like he's just a guy from Detroit, right?
Well, I'm so glad you led with the coaching tree. I'm glad we started there, Gus, because this is on the official Detroit Lions website. This is who Ben Johnson credits as his offensive influences for this offense that so many people around the National Football League, even beyond Jacksonville, who, of course, are hoping and praying that perhaps he would be interested in taking a head coaching vacancy if there should be one here in Jacksonville. This is across the league. Everyone wants to emulate the offense that has been inspired by the following people. Darrell Bevell, former Jaguars offensive coordinator turned quarterbacks coach in Miami. Adam Gase, twice a failed head coach in the National Football League. Kevin Rogers, who brought the Minnesota Vikings playbook with him to Boston College, which, of course, you alluded to that connection for Ben Johnson. Clyde Christensen, Mike Martz, John Shoup, and his father, Don, who coached at Idaho State and the Citadel. That is the influence. That is the coaching tree from which Ben Johnson comes from. And as you alluded to, what's so wild about this is people forget that Anthony Lynn was actually the first offensive coordinator under Dan Campbell in Detroit in that 3-win season back in 2021. And Ben Johnson just happened to still be there, had previously worked with Campbell in Miami. And so he kept him on staff for Matt Patricia and more or less just kind of emerges from the pack because they needed an interim and basically coached his way into the full-time gig. And credit to Dan Campbell that he was willing to take a chance on a young guy who, quite frankly, again, is not Sean McVay's barista. He does not have a tie to the offensive scheme that so many in the National Football League are trying to emulate. And instead, they were able to build their own offense that now teams around the National Football League hope, wish, pray that they were.
Yeah, I would say there's two other big influences too. One is just the NFL at large, because I said that his scheme is pretty similar to Shanahan, what Shanahan does, and I think it's just because he pulls a lot of stuff from him because he has so many good plays and so many good schemes to get players open. And like he just draws from everywhere around the league, though, not just in San Francisco or Los Angeles. Like the Jaguars ran kind of trick play against the Chargers in their playoff win against them a couple of years ago, where ETN had this run around the right side to clinch the game on a 4th down. And then Ben Johnson's Lions ran the same play, or a variation of the play basically, against the Chargers in the very next season. And so he definitely borrows plays from anywhere, but also like I think the biggest influences are more than anyone in the league or any of his past coaches. It's just Jared Goff and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Penei Sewell and everyone in the organization, but especially the players. Like when I was doing research for this podcast, I was just there's a lot of stuff talking about how great of a listener Ben Johnson is. And he's definitely a great communicator, and I'm sure we'll get more to that later. But just knowing what his players wants, he asks his offensive linemen to circle all their 5 favorite plays in the run game, and then that's always what he ends up calling. For Amon-Ra St. Brown and like the skill position players, listening to what they want to do rather than just kind of like putting them in places and expecting them to succeed. And then Jared Goff is the biggest one, and probably a big reason why Ben Johnson is such kind of at the top of so many lists for head coach candidates, is because he revitalized Jared Goff's career and was able to listen to Jared Goff and like understand what he liked and didn't like from his time under Sean McVay in Los Angeles, but then able to also add his own tweaks and his own ideas and be creative in his own right. And so especially the work with Jared Goff, but really his work with all of the skill players and just all the players in general on the offense has been really impressive.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at Ben Johnson, I think that's one of the biggest things is the individualized packages, the fact that he is able to adapt. He's able to say, okay, I have a circle peg. Let me put it into a circle hole and not create a square hole because that's what I want to do, and try to insist that said player, said circle peg, tries to fit into it. And that adaptability is certainly something that I know folks here in Jacksonville feel they've been deprived of for I don't even know how long. That dates back pre-Doug Peterson. With the exception of perhaps the 2022 season. And so that's where I think certainly he's an attractive candidate here in Jacksonville. It's why his offense is working. I do think, to your point regarding his influences from the McVay and the Shanahan tree, the most likely the reason that you would liken that is because of the layered packages. And so this is from Mark Bullock and his film room on Substack, which this was back, he covers most of the Washington Commanders, but back when so many people thought that Ben Johnson would be joining forces with Adam Peters in DC and taking over the Commanders as the head coach. Sure, we'll circle back to that at some point in the next 15 minutes. But what he referenced was this idea of layering packages, right? So this idea of one thing leads to the next. So whether that is wide zone runs that then build into play action bootlegs, that then build into screen passes after a fake bootleg, and then into a pure drop back play action, this idea of everything working in harmony, and you are running a certain number of run or pass plays to set up another factor of run or pass plays. And ultimately the offense is kind of basic, but you're able to develop additional motion, additional, whether you're lining up in a bunch or a stack and you're adding a little wrinkle to that said play. It's not like you have this treasure trove of 10,000 plays in a playbook. It's the same 5 or 6 plays, just with different window dressing on each, but they work in harmony with one another to draw the defense either into the box or draw them out into space, which gives you opportunities to operate in said box.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a big thing that's been missing in Jacksonville. We talked a lot about in this offseason about the Jaguars potentially being able to get to a more under center run game with the investments they made in their interior offensive line, and then being able to run more play action off of those under center runs. But it just hasn't really come to fruition, honestly. I feel like they were doing it a little bit towards the beginning of the year, but I've given Peterson's staff credit before for having a diverse run game and being able to run a lot of different types of runs rather than like just sticking to inside zone or something like that. But the thing is, they don't really marry it very well. I think they've tried doing that, especially again earlier this season, especially with a lot of power runs. Because like you just said, like wide zone and then bootleg off of it. With the Jaguars, I think tried to do a lot this season was a lot of power runs and like runs going directly at the defense, a lot of gap runs, and then running play action off of that and keeping Lawrence in the pocket and just attacking.
Which is hilarious because people around the league have said to me when Trevor Lawrence rolls out to his right, especially if he's looking for Evan Ingram or a tight end on the run, it's one of the most undefeated plays in the National Football League. And it's what makes him one of the more feared quarterbacks when he is operating at peak efficiency. And yet this team, once again, it comes back to circle peg, circle hole, square peg, square hole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've tried to run the play action, but just hasn't really worked because of mostly play design. Like what you're saying, like it's cool that they're doing these vertical shot plays, especially because Trevor Lawrence has such a big arm and you have Brian Thomas Jr. But defenses are kind of ready for it because it's like there's not a lot of adaptivity in Peterson's offense. Like I think one of the cool things about Ben Johnson as a candidate is that he hasn't done anything yet. Like, yeah, the Lions offense has been really productive under his watch, but he hasn't been to a Super Bowl. He hasn't won a Super Bowl. I kind of feel like Peterson, after he won the Super Bowl, was probably like, all right, like now I know that like my stuff works.
It's built.
I don't really need to change it that much. But Ben Johnson is very, very good at changing, not only just like from season to season or game to game, but like from drive to drive. He's super duper proactive as a coach, which I appreciate because I feel like Peterson is very reactive. And like one example is like Peterson's idea of like scheming up a player would be like having Brian Thomas Jr. run a slot fade. But if like you need a certain defensive look in order for that play to work. And so you're kind of like leaning on the defense to kind of work with you. But Ben Johnson is like just much more proactive, and he's just going more against the defense and trying to, I don't know, I can't think of the right word for it, but he's being aggressive and making the defense react to him as opposed to the other way around. And definitely, like you said, from the Substack you mentioned, it's a good point where the 2 points that he made, Mark, was just the things that stick out from Ben Johnson's offense is the sequencing and then putting skill position players in a good position to succeed. We see that a lot with Jamar Gibbs especially, and we haven't seen that a lot with Travis Etienne, where like the Jags did try to do a lot more kind of pitches and outside runs for him in 2022. But in terms of just designing screens or like truly designing plays to get him in space one-on-one, there hasn't really been a lot of that. Like there was that play that I mentioned earlier in the Chargers game, but it was like one trick play in a playoff scenario. Like they just don't do it enough.
And even then, you can make the argument that in 2022, teams figured out by the second half of the season that they were just trying to get Travis Etienne out to the boundary. And as long as you brought extra help to the boundary, they were not going to attempt anything inside zone, anything right up the gut, because that's not his skill set. That's not his forte. And so that was kind of the Jaguars' answer to getting him out in space. I know we have a couple questions. Keep them coming. We love the questions. Gus will do some group chat therapy when I have to bounce around 9:30. And yes, we will get into the conversation of if Ben Johnson even wants this job here with the Jacksonville Jaguars. But first, let's dive a little bit more into the numbers of what we've seen from his Lions offenses. And let's especially tap into, Gus, that concept of play action, because that is certainly where Jared Goff has made his bread and butter during his time in Detroit. The Detroit Lions this season, #1 in the National Football League, but the rate honestly surprised me. They've run play action 37.3% of their passing plays. How do I still feel like that's too low? Because I just feel like that's been every single Lions highlight that I've watched has been that it's come off of play action. And so we pair that. And thank you to Andrew Kessler up in Boston, a Jags fan who does some great numbers, although I think he's retired in light of the Jaguars' 2-8 record. This is back from October before the Jaguars faced the Packers. In 2024, when they ran play action, the Jaguars ran it about 26% of the time, so lower than that 37.1% mark. Trevor Lawrence, 43 of 62 for 568 yards, 27 first downs, 2 touchdowns, 3 50-plus yard passes, and 8 20-plus yard passes. Seems to me like play action is where Trevor Lawrence has a lot of success, and yet I know he's out this week against the Detroit Lions. Play action is also where Ben Johnson has had a lot of success as a play caller.
Yeah, we shall see. I feel like for Trevor, play action is something that he's always been able to do, but just hasn't really been like truly weaponized in that sense. Because in high school and college, like he was always just dropping back in shotgun and able to use his athleticism and the athleticism of his pass catchers to just win reps. And now that he's in the NFL and everyone in the NFL is talented, he can't really just rely on simple concepts of just winning because of talent. And you got to be able to rely on more and be able to use misdirection and be able to have a coach that puts players in a position to succeed. I've been harping on Peterson's staff all season for that, and I feel like Johnson definitely brings that in spades. Do you have any hesitations about Ben Johnson? I mean, obviously the fact that he's never been a head coach, like just inexperience in general. But other than that, is there anything that you're just a question mark for him as a head coach candidate?
Yeah, I've been waiting for this episode for quite some time, Gus. Over the last month or so, I've been on my own, in the words of, dare I say, he who must not be named, doing a deep dive into Ben Johnson. I've spoken to people across the National Football League. I've spoken to people in Detroit, spoken to people who worked with him in Miami, people here in Jacksonville. The biggest question mark regarding Ben Johnson, is he a leader of men? And that is not to say he isn't a great leader of the offense, but that is to say, would he be able to manage not just the offense, but the defense, special teams, all the personalities in a locker room? Or, as a couple Detroit reporters have already pointed out in a couple of columns this week, because of course the Jaguars-Lions matchup certainly asks the question of, is this where he could be coaching next? This idea of Ben Johnson only will take a head coaching job if it's the right owner, it's the right situation, because he doesn't want to be another one of these guys who just takes a job because it's one of 32, to which I say, and I want to give credit to, from A to Z Sports, Mike Payton up in Detroit, who pointed this out in his mailbag earlier this week. Ben Johnson may just like this idea of he leads the offense, he goes home, and all he has to worry about is crafting the offense. He doesn't have to worry about managing the PR. He doesn't have to worry about managing expectations, keeping the locker room together. He just can go into his office, draw up some plays, come out, say, here's what we're going to run. Let me meet with the offensive line. Let me meet with the quarterback, meet with the running backs. I've got everybody on the same page, and we're good to go. And it's probably a little bit more stress-free. He also makes more money than Dan Campbell, as does Aaron Glenn. That was done by design to keep both of those individuals in Detroit. They treat him well up in Motown. He and his wife seem to love living there, despite the fact that he's from North Carolina. But for me, it ultimately comes back to, is he a leader of men? As we have seen throughout the adversity-filled 2024 season, I think you need someone, much like who we saw in Doug Peterson was back in 2022, who's not afraid of losses, who's not afraid to adapt, to change things up, and to keep the message the same. And again, it's still very early, but again, in those conversations I've had, the common theme that I have heard, and to go back to the tree that you alluded to off the top of the program, for those who are just joining us, I've had more than one person say to me, as much as we hope he would be the next hotshot young offensive mind coach, the next LaFleur, the next Shanahan, McVay, Adam Gase is in that tree. And there's a lot of people around the league who have concerns that this could be a Gase situation. And that's not to say Adam Gase wasn't a brilliant offensive mind, because he was once upon a time, but what is he remembered for? He's remembered for being a failed head coach, because ultimately Peter Principle, he got one rung above perhaps where his strengths were as an offense coordinator in terms of hiring and positions of power.
Yeah, if Ben Johnson does want to stay Detroit and stay happy with his family and all the good vibes are going up there, then sure, I don't know, but my read on the situation, my assumption is that he wants to be a head coach, and especially because he's never been a head coach before. I feel like it makes sense to be a head coach and maybe you fail once or twice and you're like, okay, coordinating is for me, and take the Spags route now that he's winning championships, first in New York and now in Kansas City. And so I feel like he wants to be a head coach, but as someone was just saying on your show, Helmets and Heels, he's just not going to take the first opportunity because he doesn't want to be one and done, and he doesn't want to get fired prematurely. So he wants to make sure that he's given just a real chance. And so I think he's just pretty much waiting for the right opportunity. But again, that's just kind of my assumption on it. And then I agree with you in terms of the question mark, where it's certainly not a weakness in his profile. It's just an unknown of, can he lead men? Because I think all of the stuff about him as a coordinator is A+ and excellent, and anyone would want him running and calling their offense. But in terms of being the CEO type head coach and being able to have people bounce back from adversity, because every team goes through adversity at some point during a season, and especially during championship seasons. And so to be able to kind of get through and be able to right the ship through choppy waters is big time. And so I do think that even if he seems quiet-natured, I think there's like the positive that he's been in Detroit is a good one for him, because even if he doesn't have head coaching experience, he has experience with arguably the best motivator in a head coach in the league in Dan Campbell. And so even if they're two very different styles of head coaches, like I don't think Ben Johnson is going to be like doing emotional speeches in the locker room and having like crying during post-game pressers and stuff like that. But like Ben Johnson can still learn from it, because he can still say like the crying isn't what matters. It's just like he's showing that he cares. And Ben Johnson has showed that he's cared in Detroit by putting in long hours and grinding away at the offense. And so now offensive players like Amon-Ra St. Brown said in an ESPN article that he trusts Ben Johnson because he knows how much effort he puts into it. And so like I think that having players know that you care is a really big deal. And so I think that he'll be able to convince players, that he does care. And so that'll go a long way. And that's not the only part of the equation of being just culture setter and a leader as a head coach. But I do have some confidence in him in being able to do that because of his experience with Dan Campbell, even if he has not been a head coach before.
Right. Like I said, my concern is that when adversity hits, does he retreat into the bunker to start scheming up plays? And perhaps at that juncture, he's earned the trust of the team and they understand he's going into the bunker because he's trying to scheme you guys out of this. But at the same time, I am curious what injection of life this locker room here in Jacksonville needs. And is it someone who perhaps would be more cerebral, sterile, as opposed to, yes, the biting the kneecaps, the crying? Like maybe that's what they need. Maybe it's not. Like I noted, I do have to run here in a little bit. So there were two other quick stats I wanted to throw out at you guys. And I know Gus will stick around. So keep the comments coming, keep the questions coming, especially about the offensive line, because that's where I'm going to go to first. Outside zone. That is the run scheme that we were told when Phil Rauscher arrived here in Jacksonville, that's what he would be running. Of course, he was not the run game coordinator for the first time he is this season. The Detroit Lions run outside zone 48% of the time. That is fourth in the National Football League. Perhaps not surprising behind these three teams. The Falcons, Zach Robinson, of course, a disciple of Sean McVay. The 49ers, Kyle Shanahan. And the Saints, Clint Kubiak, of course, a disciple of the Gary Kubiak scheme as well, which also implements a lot of outside zone, which Rauscher is also a part of that tree. So wanted to throw that out at you guys because, again, outside zone being a Ben and Johnson staple, that being a fit perhaps in Jacksonville. And finally, I'll leave you guys with this. What coverage schemes has this Detroit Lions offense seen the most in 2024? The answer is cover three. They have seen that look 39.7% of the time. Again, they have faced cover three the most of anyone in the National Football League. The Jags have run 75 snaps all season of cover three. So very curious to see how Ryan or Rick Nielsen deploys his defense going up against such a multifaceted attack from Ben Johnson and company up in Motown.
Yeah, it'll be a Jaguars game. Mia, my last question for you is just if Ben Johnson is unavailable, like who do you think today would be your favorite head coach candidate? Not even necessarily for the Jaguars, or no, let's make it for the Jaguars. Like considering they have a franchise quarterback, that is a big part of the equation. And so I just think the most interesting question in terms of the candidates for Jacksonville is not who do you want, because I think the answer should be Ben Johnson. It's just who do you want if Ben Johnson is not available?
Yeah, if you're going to go young offensive mind, big stumper of Liam Cohen down in Tampa. I think when you hear what Baker Mayfield and that offense have had to say about the conversations they've had with him, not about football, he does scream leader of men. He, of course, also made Will Levis an NFL draft prospect, which is incredible. So Liam Cohen, if you want to go young offensive mind, I think Todd Monken's going to get head coaching interest this offseason, truly, after what he did in Georgia with Stetson Bennett, what he's been able to do with Lamar Jackson. Again, that word adaptability that we've talked about this entire podcast, the idea of he can scheme it up for Stet the same way he could scheme it up for Lamar, even obviously being in his 50s, a bit of a veteran, never been a head coach before at the NFL level. I do think Monken will get some looks and get some interviews. And finally, yes, I do agree with those of you who want to talk Mike Vrabel. Now, if you were to go with Vrabel, who is currently the betting odds favorite to be the Dallas Cowboys head coach, I'm curious if, much like in Tennessee, although it didn't work out, would he bring in a young disciple of the McVay tree like he did with one Matt LaFleur once upon a time.
And then Arthur Smith was running stuff that wasn't all too different, even if it wasn't technically McVay stuff. But thank you for your time, Mia. Appreciate you coming in. We will see you on Sunday after the game.
I'll be here in the home studio, not going to Detroit. A-okay with that. Bye, guys.
All right, Mia. See you Sunday. All right, let's see if you guys have any questions for me. Raising Cane said he would want Vrabel, although it makes me kind of nauseous. Yeah, why does it make you nauseous? That seems fair, but yeah, Vrabel would be like probably the best quote unquote CEO type coach available. Like if you boil it down to 3 buckets, offensive guy, defensive guy, CEO type guy, then probably your top coordinates or top candidates are Ben Johnson for offense, Mike Vrabel for CEO, and then Jesse Minter for defense. I feel like, or Aaron Glenn, those 2 guys are pretty top dogs for the defensive side. Duval TV said, I couldn't do Vrabel. It would be weird to see him in teal as opposed to Tennessee Navy, but Coach Prime would be a mistake. I don't have a take on whether Deion Sanders would be a good head coach in Jacksonville. I kind of doubt it, but maybe. I feel like he'd probably have the same problem that Urban had, where it's like talking to and motivating college kids is way different than grown adults and professionals. And I don't know if it would work. Maybe if like the Jags got the first overall pick and then they got Travis Hunter, I don't know. That feels like a universe I'd rather skip, or a multiverse I'd rather not be in. Let me be in the Ben Johnson one, right? Raising Cane also asked earlier, question is, does Ben Johnson see Jax as a place he wants to be? Meaning if Baalke is still here, does he see Schott as a roadblock? I know that Pete Prisco tweeted a couple weeks ago now that if Baalke was in Jacksonville still, then it would not be good for the coaching cycle. Like Ben Johnson, and not just Ben Johnson, but other candidates would not want to come to Jacksonville if Baalke was still here. And so, yeah, I don't know anything about the situation personally, and so I would assume that that is a fair assumption to make, that Jacksonville is going to be way less of a desirable location to take a job as head coach if Trent Baalke is retained. But, yeah, I don't know. Boy Smathers said, why change anything? Make them play through it. We have a 2-year stadium built in front of us. Who's going to want to come here with all the chaos to come? I mean, it's already chaos. Like, there's rumors of the quarterback getting midseason surgery and getting shut down for the year because they're 2-8, even despite the team owner saying it was the best roster in franchise history. Like, this isn't chaos to you? I don't know why you want to play through this chaos just because you're afraid of worse chaos somehow coming. I don't know. Yeah. Duval TV did say it's not even necessarily the coaching in Detroit, in my humble opinion. It's the fact that they have one of the best offensive lines in the NFL is what leads them to success, in parentheses, in my honest opinion. Thank you for your honest opinion, Duval TV. I think, like, it's obviously not just one thing. It's a little bit of the career resurgence from Jared Goff. He definitely deserves credit. Obviously, Ben Johnson is a big part of it. You got skill position players like Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jahmyr Gibbs and Jameson Williams, who are all game breakers. Same Laporta. But yeah, the offensive line is definitely a very big deal. I would say it's objectively the best offensive line in the NFL, especially after Jason Kelce retired from Philly last year. So yeah, it would be interesting. Like, say Ben Johnson is hired by the Jaguars, it'd be really interesting this upcoming offseason to see just what his approach is in year one of like the mini rebuild of the Jaguars, of like whether he attacks skill players and says we want to be able to get the ball to our skill players and help out Trevor Lawrence that way, or if he says we're going to help out Trevor Lawrence by investing super heavily in offensive linemen instead. I guess either way, assuming there's going to be a new coach and especially a new general manager in 2025, it'll be fun to see just what the approach is. Duval TV said, "Is there any way to get Tony Baselli involved with the coaching or GM?" No, or I can't get him involved. I know you're not asking me to, but I don't know why you are asking me to either. Like, Tony Baselli is Jaguars' only Hall of Fame player and hosts a podcast on the team site, the team YouTube, and like does other media stuff for him. But like, what qualifies him other than being a former player? That's my question. All right, I think that'll do it. Thanks to everyone for tuned in. We'll be back on Sunday after the Lions game with Hacker, Mia, Tommy. See what happens. I'm excited for this one. Hacker and I were laughing about it after last week's show. Just we were getting giddy about just how bad this one might get. I'm going to give a score prediction 40-6. I can't see Jacksonville scoring double-digit points. So have a good one, y'all. Thanks for tuning in. Where's my ad? Here it is.
The Duval Rundown has been brought to you by Injury Care Centers. Your path to recovery starts here.